So our first speaker today is Carole Llewellyn. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Carole Llewellyn. She's Professor in Applied Aquatic Bioscience at the University of Swansea. Carole's interests are in microalgae and cyanobacteria, how they function in their natural environment, especially in relation to photophysiology. She is also interested in how algae can be used to tackle society's big challenges. From her early research in carotenoids, Carole developed an interest in algal biotechnology, using her knowledge on microalgal carotenoids and UV sunscreen compounds, working with industry to develop personal care products for anti-aging and cosmetics. So Carole currently leads on the EU Interreg Northwest Europe project, ALG-AD, developing the circular economy thinking using waste from the anaerobic digestion of food and farm waste to cultivate algae for animal feed and high-value products. So Carole, I think we're over to you if you want to share your screen and give your presentation, please.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks very much, Mel, for that introduction. As Mel said, I'm a professor in Applied Aquatic Bioscience at Swansea University. So I spent many years studying plankton, particularly phytoplankton in the oceans, and more recently I have been applying that science that I've acquired over the many years. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to plankton, mainly phytoplankton, and why they are so important to our planet. So I'm starting with this unusual slide of leaves on a tree, because we spend most of our life on land and see plants and forests and trees all around us. And we hear a lot about how trees are very important in capturing CO2, how important they are to climate change. And we often forget that 2/3 of our planet are covered by oceans. And within those oceans are many plant-like organisms. They're microscopic, so we can't see them. So we tend to not think about how important they are in the biodiversity of our planet, and actually also how they are important in carbon cycling and thus in climate change. So the talk is about the oceans and about phytoplankton. So phytoplankton, primarily phytoplankton, I'll talk a little bit about zooplankton as well. So phytoplankton, phyto means plant-like, and that's exactly what they do. They photosynthesize like plants, so they capture CO2 and they convert that CO2 into organic compounds. And plankton, so phytoplankton, plankton merely means floating. So the talk will provide an overview on phytoplankton, talk a little bit about the biodiversity within the oceans of the phytoplankton, and then why we need to protect them. So basically, phytoplankton are essential to our oceans and to our planet and to the way that we live. And to support that, just to highlight how important phytoplankton are in the ocean, let's just have a look at the carbon in the major reservoirs on our Earth. So if we look at the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, it's 722 gigatons. Whereas if we look at it in the oceans, we've got 38,400 gigatons. So we have 50 times as much carbon in the oceans as in the atmosphere. And again, if we look at the amount of carbon on land, it's about 2,000 gigatons. So again, you can just see how important the oceans are in terms of the amount of carbon. And the main lubricant of that carbon in the ocean, are the phytoplankton. So phytoplankton take in CO2 from the atmosphere and they convert it into organic carbon, which is then recycled. So the phytoplankton form what we call the base of all the food webs in the ocean. And as you can see in this slide, it's a very pretty light microscopic scope image of a cell of phytoplankton cells in the ocean. What I want to highlight is the biodiversity, the wide range of shapes and forms that phytoplankton in the ocean take. Most of them are single-celled. Some of them, let me just find a pen here, are formed into chains. Some of them are circular in shape, and some of them are what we call pennae in shape. But they have, and some of them have flagella and can actually swim, but most of them are free floating. But there are tens and thousands of different species over about 50 different classes. So they are much more diverse than any of plants on land, actually. And if we look at it globally, phytoplankton are responsible for approximately 50% of global primary production. And actually, you often hear, and it's true, that every other breath that you take and breathing in the oxygen is a result of oxygen that the phytoplankton have released. So they're really important in not only in the oceans, but also on land in terms of carbon dioxide and oxygen. And actually 30 to 50% of CO2 from human activity has been taken up from the atmosphere into the oceans, rivers and lakes, and then recycled through the phytoplankton. So they are an extremely important component of the whole global ecosystem. And like I said, they actually form the base of the food web. So they're taken up they're eaten by zooplankton, which are then eaten by fish. And of course, then we eat fish, so they're very important to the global fishing industry. And basically, without phytoplankton on our planet would literally die. I've included a slide of zooplankton just so that you can see then relative. There's these ones with the flagella here are the zooplankton, so they then munch up all of these, the zooplankton, the phytoplankton. So zoo meaning animal. So again, these are tiny drifting animals in our oceans. And so these zooplankton are very important to the turnover of this carbon because they recycle that carbon, they ingest it into what we call, well, it's their poo, fecal pellets, and much of this carbon then sinks out of the ocean into the sediment. So zooplankton are very important in processing the carbon within the phytoplankton. And then, of course, the zooplankton are food for the fish, although some fish eat phytoplankton directly as well. So I just now want to move on to a little bit about the biodiversity of the phytoplankton. So phytoplankton are divided into about 50 classes, and I'm just going to briefly whiz through some of the very common classes. Diatoms, so is the first class that I want to cover. And basically, I mean, these are really, really pretty, as you can see with this microscope image here. And this is a Coconodesmus. And basically, these diatoms are formed by glass. They are covered they're basically minuscule glass greenhouses, but they have very, very intricate patterns. So this intricate pattern you can see here is basically glass. And then the green blobs that you can see are the chloroplasts, which are full of pigments. So these are quite big in size, between about 50 microns and 250 microns. And these are what we call centric or circular shaped diatoms. And then you have pennate diatoms. These primarily live in sediments, and this is a navicular. I mean, in Latin, I think this means like a small ship. But again, you can see it has a glass shell and then pores, and then it is divided in two. In fact, diatoms are almost like petroslides. They have two bits that kind of fit in one another in the two glass outer shells. The next group that I want to touch on is haptophytes, and these are extremely important in many areas of the ocean, and I'm going to go on to show you a satellite image of how the big expanses that they cover in the oceans. The very interesting thing about haptophytes is that they have these, or many of them do, have these liths on the outside, and these are made out of calcium carbonate, basically chalk. So rather than having a glass wall, they have a chalk wall. And one of the interesting things about haptophytes is we're all very familiar with the White Cliffs of Dover. Well, the White Cliffs of Dover were made from coccolith shells over 70 million years ago. And these coccoliths are still very important in our oceans today. I've also included a micrograph here of some of these liths being broken down. And if you look very carefully, you can see these little yellow dots. And these are actually viruses. This is a virus attacking a coccolith cell and actually breaking it down. And then finally, I just want to touch on the dinoflagellates, because these are probably one of my favorite groups. And basically, rather than having calcium carbonate or silica, these have made of cellulose, and absolutely beautiful structures that float through our oceans. And these dinoflagellates have an enormous genome size, and some of them can be toxic. So I'm quite aware that time is running on, and I could talk a long time about all of these things, but I'm going to whiz through the next few slides. So rather than looking down a microscope and showing you some single cells, we're now moving out to satellite images. And this is the southwest of England, as you can see here. And this cloud, what looks like a cloud in the atmosphere, is actually a reflection of liths that have been released from these Emiliania huxleyi cells. So you can just see how big the bloom of Emiliania huxleyi is in the ocean. So this is produced from satellite images. And likewise, this is an image, it's a composite image produced by NASA, and you can just see in the top here how much algae or phytoplankton are growing in the oceans. And this changes over time. So this dark green here is high levels of the chlorophyll that is monitored. There's also higher levels or medium levels around the equator, and that is produced by cyanobacteria, which is the final group that I want to talk about. So these are minuscule, very small, about less than 2 microns in size, single cells, very simple structures. They have no organelles inside. They're called picoprokaryotes. So they're very simple cells, but there are enormous numbers around the equatorial regions, as can be seen in these global images here of Prochlorococcus in the top one, and then Sinococcus in the bottom one. And they are the most they're very highly abundant. You can get over 100,000 cells per mil. Okay, so those are some pretty slides. I just want to go on and summarize now. But phytoplankton play a major role in the ecology of our planet, just as I've shown. They underpin aquatic food webs and fisheries, incredibly important in the carbon cycle across the globe. They also regulate the atmosphere through the release of other gases that I haven't had time to go into now, but they're important in cloud formation. And they've also are very important in terms of the evolution of our planet. In terms of climate change, the biodiversity is being affected by CO2, temperature, and nutrient mixing. So as the temperature rises, the sea becomes more stratified. That reduces the amount of nutrients and changes the type of phytoplankton that are present in the surface of the oceans. We also have more CO2 going into the ocean, which is causing ocean acidification, which again affects different types of algae, in particular the coccoliths, the haptophytes that I was talking to you about. We also now have more pollution going into the environment, particularly from farm runoff and nitrates, causing eutrophication and an increase in harmful algal blooms. Finally, I just want to touch on more applied aspects. We know that phytoplankton are really important in fisheries, and that's because phytoplankton are rich in proteins and oils. And we can use these proteins and oils in other foods as well, directly as a food source for humans and in other animal feeds. They're also rich in natural products, rich in antioxidants and anti-inflammatories that aren't present in land plants. And they can be used to provide climate solutions and environmental cleanup, which leads to my last slide about a project that I'm involved in, where we are cultivating algae in so-called photobioreactor tubes, as you can see here on the left-hand side. And we are taking waste that has been digested, so food and farm waste that has been digested anaerobically in anaerobic digestion, that's AD technology. This produces a digestate which is rich in nitrate that we feed to the algae. So we're using waste, food and farm waste to grow algae. Once we grow the algae, we are processing it to feed back into animals. In this instance, we've been using it to feed to piglets. So this is very much in developing the circular economy. Okay, I'm going to leave it there because I see that otherwise I'm going to run over time, but that was a very brief introduction to phytoplankton and why they are so important to our planet and how we can use them. Thank you very much.